Name's Bob Brandeberry. My current occupation, I guess I'm the operator of several small self-employed businesses here in the community. The one most recognizable that everybody associates me with is the tire shop that's a block north of campus here at the University of Rio Grande.
Okay. What was your part in the Silver Bridge disaster?
I was a recent graduate of the University of Rio Grande, 1967. Married, had a new baby, looking for a job, had a degree in social studies, couple of degrees, also teaching and education, and the only job that I could find at the time to support my family was in Point Pleasant, which was on the other side of the Ohio River. And so I was a new teacher, traveling back and forth, living here in Rio Grande, going over there. 17 miles took about 22 minutes if you behaved yourself, to work your way through traffic of both towns at that time and back and forth. It gave a good chance to unwind from the pressures of teaching, and we was in a high school of 800 kids in the top 3 grades, and you could get out of there and you would be about civil for your family by the time you got back here. I mean, it was one of those kind of relaxing things. You get yourself geared up driving over and get unwound coming back. So that at the time, you know, the only avenue to get from A to B was across that bridge that was known as the Silver Bridge, basically because it was always kept painted silver, and it was a looming thing on the horizon that everybody that traveled up and down the river could see long before you got actually to it, whatnot. One of the things that I experienced that I think has some significance to the bridge catastrophe, which that's the only way to describe the situation when you sever 2 states and 2 communities that's intertwined together. A couple of weeks before that incident occurred, on the West Virginia side, the concrete abutment went up fairly sharp there, and then it transferred over, and there was an expansion joint there that you switched from concrete to bridge floor. A couple of weeks before this situation occurred, that suddenly adjusted. This basically, one day it was fine, the next day there was a height difference there. I had a fairly new car, and it was enough of an impact if you were traveling at the normal speed over there that it would make the dash make quite a noise, you know, when you bumped over it. And the exposed part was rusty where it had been mated together.
Now, was the bridge higher, or was the...
The bridge floor was just suddenly higher.
Okay.
And I had never, you know, nobody paid too much attention to that. Evidently, the officials that was involved, which would have been a West Virginia problem because the bridge technically belonged to them, evidently nothing was ever paid any attention to it. I mean, it was winter, it was December. You don't just go out and start digging into things, you know, that wasn't possibly anything to dig into for any reason. And the bridge was used heavily. It was a busy thoroughfare. Had a stoplight on each end, which always, if there was any traffic flow amount to anything, it always backed up about halfway to the center of the bridge both directions, and the stoplights were not in sequence. So you always had a line of traffic, and you were normally having to wait. And it was a suspension bridge which floated. Not too many of them were built at that time back in 1928, but it was a kind of unique type situation. And the floor, when you were sitting there waiting in traffic, holding your foot on the brake, when traffic went the opposing way, it would give you, this moving, floating feeling, that it was supposed to do that. But it had flex built into it, so it would give. The particular incident there on the 15th, I worked late trying to get ready for the Monday morning classes. And I commonly, having known them from the county that I came from up north, there was a junkyard on the other end, basically almost at the foot of the bridge, called Baird's. And I knew both the Baird boys and the dad, and I would swing in there and see what new occurred, what he found or accumulated, or for a few minutes, sometimes on the way home. That was one of my stops that I kind of unwound at, to get away from the paper and pencil type situation. But that night it was late and it was cold, and I didn't stop there. And when I got downtown, whatever time, there was 2 stoplights at that time between downtown Gallipolis and where the bridge was. When I got downtown, the fire siren down there was ringing up at the high pitch and just staying there. Well, I had just joined the fire department out here in Rio Grande the year before, and they normally had some sequential signals down there that would tell the firemen which area of the town, to go to, because we didn't have the modern pagers and whatnot that we had today. Everything was done through audible things. So I swung in out of curiosity, and I said, "What's going on?" The guy said, "The bridge fell." I said, "What bridge fell?" "The Silver Bridge fell." I said, "Nah, I just came across it." He said, "Well, you can't go back across it." And, that time lag would have probably been, at that time in traffic flows, you're talking about 5-8 minutes or something to scoot down Eastern Avenue from that time. So I had just installed a red light in this car, because I joined the fire department. It was the thing to do. So I kicked the lights on, went back up First Avenue, and decided, well, I can get into Bear's junkyard because I know all them, and that'll be there, and I can swing in there. And I thought, well, best call home, because, they'll be, this news will spread fast. But you couldn't call. I mean, it was just busy signal. No matter what you tried, I tried 8 or 10 times, it was busy signal. So went back to see what we could accomplish, because I looked at the bridge going up the river with this news in my mind, and I was seeing the railroad bridge. It was, you can see a bridge, but it wasn't the right color. And you got up there, and basically what you would see with the naked eye was what all the pictures showed, and there was a little bit showing on the Ohio side because it covered a piece of land area there, and there wasn't anything else. One piece sticking up on the pier over on the West Virginia side, and it was gone. And it was hard to fathom, because minutes earlier I'd crossed that bridge and it was behaving very normal, other than this jump over on the West Virginia side that had occurred. I worked there with them looking for survivors. And as I told Greg yesterday, some cars had virtually no damage to them that was on the Ohio side. Some were flatter than a pancake, depending on which way the concrete slabs folded up, upon the impact of falling. Of course, it was getting very dark. It was cold. Air temperature was 19 degrees. The water temperature was supposed to be around 40 to 44. The wind coming off there was just cut through you like a knife. And there was nothing else happening, so I packed up and came home. Was surprised to find my mother and father-in-law's car in front of my house. Wife couldn't find me. Called Mom, of course. Mom and Dad jumped in the car and came down, to see what was going on and figure out where I was. And of course, there was all kinds of reports by that time on the news that bridge went down with a full load of people on it, and I hadn't more than just hit the house, and our fire alarm went off, and they were wanting people that could, fire departments that could come up with generators for lights. So I load the local generator that we had in the back of my almost new car and went back and spent a good part of the rest of the night there still trying. They were trying to get one of the trucks pulled out that was in the water, one of the semis, thinking there might still be somebody alive in the sleeper. And it was wedged so bad, I mean, they pulled off the front bumper and they pulled off the front axle and finally come to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be easily pulled out with the equipment that they had there at the time that they could find. And of course the traffic on Route 7 there in front of it was rubbernecking people, I guess, and couldn't believe, just like me, as I traveled up the road, it can't be gone, it was just there. But it was gone, and there was all kinds of people, all kinds of traffic. Red lights was such a, at that time everything was red lights, now it's red and blue, but it was so mesmerizing you couldn't hardly walk around the scene because of the flashing lights. You almost had to shield yourself from the light so that you could see enough to walk. And it come to the conclusion that there just wasn't anything else that was going to happen that night. I got released and came back home late in the evening, but the timeline was pretty close to have been there and missed a situation. Had to go back that next week and teach in the high school. People weren't too much interested in history and Civil War battles and whatnot with all that confusion going on down the street. The high school kids would come in with all kinds of reports of hour to hour of whatever they could find out, and of course came back every time at lunchtime. Everybody went downtown to eat lunch and find out what was going and what they'd pulled out and whose car they'd found and was there anyone in the car and stories of this nature.
You didn't have anybody in class that...
I had one student in class that his dad drove for Pickens Cab Company, which was the cab company of Point Pleasant. And he'd rode downtown with his dad. He'd picked him up after school. They picked up a fare. Man wanted to go across to the bank to cash his check on the other side. And he dropped him off there at the foot of the bridge. Said, "Go down here and buy me a pack of cigarettes. I'll be right back." And his dad made it to about the center of the bridge, and the bridge fell out of sight, along with his dad and the Pickens cab car. We had 3 teachers from the high school that was on the bridge. One of them being Coach White, that everybody in the world knew, the local coach. We had a teacher that was pregnant, that was on maternity leave, and another one that was involved there that happened to be on the bridge, because that was the link between the two communities, and everybody traveled back and forth across that. And I think there was, 46, 47 cars or trucks at the point was on there, because the stoplights backed them up and loaded that bridge up on a continuous basis if there was any traffic flow, and it was always traffic flow. I mean, it was the link for north and south. But
So how was it living with the absence of the bridge afterwards, immediately?
well, immediately you had to drive upriver to Pomeroy and cross over into Mason, come back down the West Virginia side, which was time-consuming. Everything was 2-lane road then. I mean, not into the 4-lane type thing that we've got. Basically, those are still 2-lane roads up and down both sides of the higher river. Took a lot more time.
You rather do that than take like the ferry or...
Well, ferry wasn't immediate. There was a time period there that was the only way we could get to our job designation was to do that. And then they got a ferry. Ferry was quite an experience. They could put several vehicles on the ferry boat. Basically what it was a converted barge, just a flat deck barge with a kind of a chain link, couple chains draped around it with some upright poles, you know, so you couldn't fall off, and had a tugboat that was centered and hooked to it in the middle on one side. He just swivel the boat back and forth whichever way he wanted to go, and they had to build a landing on this side. There was a landing of sorts on under the Shadle Bridge at that time that was over in between Henderson and Point Pleasant. They had to cut a place up here in Kanawha to build a place for it to land. Fog was very interesting to travel across it, with the thick fog that would be there in the mornings. If there would be fog sometimes on the river when there wasn't any on both sides. It just hung over it because of the temperature inversion. Sometimes very thick. We could talk like we were talking here right now on camera, and you could hear the people on the other boat that close, but you couldn't see them. And you learned about how they would blow their horns to signal each other after they got so close that their little radar they had at that time would just go into one glob because they were so close together they couldn't make out where each other was. And then when they got to the point they got really concerned, they would just hold the horn down wide open, you know, so that they could try to figure out where the other guy was. And many times we could hear them talking, but you couldn't see them. It was that thick. If there was white caps on the river, the barge wasn't going to work. If you got down to the landing and there was white caps on the river from the wind, you just turned around and made that trip up the river and down the river on the other side. Sometimes they would, because there was a stone quarry here near our community here, and they hauled stone into West Virginia, they'd put 5 or 6 of the loaded stone trucks on there, and there would be water on top the deck of the barge. You couldn't get out of your car or anything because your feet would get wet. You know, the waves would come right across the. A little bit unnerving to. I wasn't had any knowledge about what the capacities was of that particular thing, but they didn't seem to be too concerned about it. You know, they didn't think it would sink. So that's the way we traveled back and forth till the new bridge was constructed. As I told Greg yesterday in a short conversation, the school system, partially to help them more than it did us, but all of us that lived on this side of the river got first period prep periods the next school season, because that gave them 45 minutes that we could struggle in finding a way to get there, and it didn't upset the school program floor mat, you know. They didn't have to hire somebody to sub for us till we got there. So they helped us, and it helped them equally well, whatnot.
So how's this changed your mindset at all, or your life over the years, if it has?
I don't know if it's changed my mindset. It's something that doesn't go away. It was a catastrophic thing to happen. It seemed inconceivable it could happen, you know, in your community.
I'm sure when you cross bridges, you kind of look around and.
I trust bridges. I'm not nervous. I mean, if you wanted to be nervous, the Silver Bridge that we had at that time after it fell, then you had to cross the Shadle Bridge, which was even narrower, and they'd eventually taken the floor out and put that grating thing in so you could see the water underneath, and your cars would wiggle bad, especially if you put snow tires on, which was characteristic to that time. They'd walk all over the place. If you got nervous about anything, you was more nervous about it than you were the replacement bridges later on and whatnot. The unique thing, which I did not discuss with Greg yesterday, and I think it has some bearing on where I started my story about the abutment on the West Virginia side, suddenly had this layer that we had to jump over that I was illustrating. Outside my classroom was the media center for all of Mason County. And we had a lady that operated that media center, possibly widowed, divorced, I don't know. She'd lived by herself for years, and she lived in one of those 2.5-story houses right down on the riverbank, one of the old original homes of Point Pleasant, big old rambling house, and she run around in that thing all by herself. And she was one of these kind of hypochondriacs that had this problem or that problem or something else, and everything was a crisis in her life. And when you went into the media center, she, of course, had to tell you what her day's crisis was, you know. A couple of weeks before this bridge fell, she was all excited about some screaming thing that woke her up in the middle of the night and went thud. She thought in her yard, but probably it was in the riverbank. After we look back on things, and this whole thing got settled down years later, I'm wondering, you know, we wrote her off at the time, you know, well, she just had a bad dream, because she was always on these kicks. But after we go through the whole process and it was all analyzed and spread out and reassembled down the river, on the river, whatnot, they couldn't find part of that pin that went through, I think it was I-bar 330 or something. They had them all numbered on that sequence where the bridge was built. And it was a situation of about 4 links that went together, and the pin went down through the middle of it. I've come to the conclusion in my mind, and this is just my personal thoughts, I have nothing to substantiate it, but probably at the time that floor adjusted, that pin probably broke. And it was probably a piece of that pin that she heard come screaming through the air that woke her up and went thud into the riverbank there on her property. That would account, as it loosened a little bit and got at an angle, that would have allowed that floor to come up over there, because it changed the tension on one side of that bridge. And everybody tells us that were there, that were eyewitnesses, that the one side gave way before the other side and allowed it to fall sideways.
Yeah, it turned over.
Yeah, it turned over. The link that was missing was on the upriver side. Her house is on the upriver side. I'm wondering if, and I don't know, and there's no way to ever check it out, but if that pin broke from corrosion or wear, and part of that pin come loose with the tension of that entire bridge on it, it very well could have made a screaming noise coming through the air and a thud into her property. And we just wrote it off at that time and didn't pay any attention to that, and didn't pay any attention to the floor adjustment on the West Virginia side.
So this was days before that she got
Yeah,
this.
it was probably somewhere near 2 weeks prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
Give or take a few days. And that pin being jammed in there between those 4 links, and of course it sits there and does all this floating all the time with the traffic flow on it, it possibly just worked its way on out to the point that it came apart, because part of that pin was never found.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you guys have some questions, you know, we can pursue other avenues here.
When we were talking yesterday, you were talking about the impact it had on the 2 communities, on the identity, the culture, the sense of place.
It's kind of like, I sometimes use parables in describing things to people. Let's look at the idea that, you know, we are so dependent on electricity. When the electric goes out and you have a major power outage for days or something, suddenly your life just gets totally adjusted. You were so calm. I mean, you'll walk into a room and still turn the light switch before you realize nothing's going to happen. When that bridge dropped, it literally severed the 2 communities in their lifestyle. You become so accustomed to using something that's there, and then it's not there. And the idea, well, you'll just run across the river and get this, or you'll go over to get that, or you'll go to your favorite place to go to the movies, or, I mean, all that thing is totally broken, and you can't. It was a big imposition to everybody, not just the main traffic that didn't affect us, it just drove past our communities. which was a large amount of traffic per day and per hour. But the communities themselves suddenly realized how much they needed each other. But it was a struggle to get to the other side. Whatnot. Just totally impacted your lifestyle.
How long was it until they got the new bridge up?
I was thinking it was, what, a couple years?
I haven't seen the details on it.
I was totally surprised at the magnitude of people coming together to pull that off. Of course, there was some influential people on both sides of the river that was kind of the godfathers of both communities, and I think they realized how much it impacted, and the communities worked together to pull all kinds of strings, and that new bridge went up fairly quick. I was shocked at how quick, because I mean, I'm used to Appalachia here, and things took long times, and things were slow to change, and sometimes that's good. But that new bridge got in place very quickly. Of course, we still have, it's been pretty well eradicated evidence of it on the West Virginia side. The Ohio side still has a 4-lane that comes up to Route 7 and goes nowhere. That was built to match up with that bridge, and people that might come into our community, would wonder why we have a bridge down the river and we have this 4-lane that comes up to nowhere. We that live here understand how that come to be, but
Now, was the 4-lane designed and started construction before the bridge fell?
Yeah.
Okay.
it was built basically, I think there was some idea in mind that would become a 4-lane bridge at some point down the road. But then the decision was made it was much quicker to build one downstream and build connecting roads, because you couldn't put a 4-lane real easily into
Right in the middle
downtown
of town.
Point Pleasant.
Right.
And that was very historical buildings on both sides, and we basically just had an alleyway that went to the bridge, over there. So it was built downstream where it could be built rapidly and not interfere with thoughts, about the bridge and all the people that lost their lives on the bridge and things of that nature.
When the bridge fell and the days after, and there was so much search and recovery and angst in the community, how would you describe the mood of the community? You were dealing with all those students. You were dealing with probably merchants.
I was dealing with students, and part of the teaching thing is try to create some kind of stability. It was very difficult in the classroom to keep people on task that week that we had to before we shut down for Christmas vacation, because it was just on everybody's mind. You either knew somebody that was a relative, or your friend, or something that was connected somehow to those 47 people or so that was on that bridge that no longer existed. Some had been found, some hadn't been found. Personal cars had been pulled out. Everything was stacked back up there on that, I'm going to call it government land that was abandoned where they built the ships. That was the area that they took the vehicles to, because there was constant reports coming in. This was found, that was found. Found the coach's car. Coach wasn't in the car. Coach's car had been folded up by a beam. Door was open, but he wasn't there. They didn't find him for a couple, 3 months downstream. As I was telling Greg yesterday, he was very athletic. He had enough presence of mind being dumped into the 40-degree water that he had his warm-up jacket on, one of these light type, ball type jackets, and when they found him, he didn't have any marks on him. He'd taken one arm out of the jacket. He'd already managed to get one sleeve out in the water and was attempting to swim, and evidently the water was so cold it just shut him down. But he had presence of mind after he rode the bridge down to get out of the car, and then the bridge had another second collapse after it landed. It sat there for a while, and then it folded up even more, and at that point it obviously caught his car and folded it up. But some of the people they brought in, I mean, people came in from way, 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 way to help in recovery situations. And people will tell you stories, and this is just a related story to the situation. Some of the divers would not go back down. First of all, the water was very murky, it was cold, and there was bridge debris literally folded up in all types of methods in there. But they ran into some very, very large catfish. Big enough that they decided they weren't going back down to be challenged. They just pulled off their gear and says, I'm going home. And there were so many people had those stories that was down there. Evidently they're down there. I mean, there's a lot of water right there in depth, and they were very defensive of the little spots they'd wallered out in the river bottom, and they didn't like the intrusion of somebody approaching their area. You know, they can be a pretty kind of aggressive looking thing, you know, and if it's as big as some of them described, they didn't want anything more to do with them. They'd never seen anything that large, and they weren't about to go back down and take a chance of challenging them. But that's a totally related element to the situation. But anything else that we can?
No, from your best information, did all the cars get retrieved? I know that there were a couple of.
I'm not sure. There was, I think, a very slight amount of both people and cars that was never recovered.